A mother's scream shatters the dawn as armed deputies storm her home. And within seconds, her daughter lies bleeding on the floor. But what they didn't know is, the girl's father is Delta Force. And when he finds out what they've done, no badge, no title, and no lie will save them from what's coming next. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The road stretched out before them like a scar through the Carolina woods, winding farther than Elise Morgan remembered. Dust clung to the back window of the old SUV as they rumbled over cracked asphalt and gravel, past fields where the trees leaned too close, casting long, crooked shadows across the fading afternoon light. She glanced sideways at Maya, her 16-month-old daughter, who stared out the window with headphones in, arms crossed like a shield over her chest. Elise wanted to say something comforting, something light-hearted to ease the tension that wrapped itself around the car like fog. But what was there to say? That this broken-down house at the end of nowhere was going to save them? That somehow the ghosts waiting behind its cracked walls would be kinder than the people they'd left behind in Atlanta? She gripped the steering wheel tighter, swallowing the lump in her throat. When they finally turned down the gravel path, the old Morgan house came into view. It looked worse than Elise remembered. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, shingles curling upward like brittle fingers. Vines crept up the porch columns, wrapping around them like they'd been forgotten by time itself. The front steps were cracked, one board hanging by a single rusted nail. Elise put the SUA in park and let the engine hum into silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Well," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her tired eyes. "Home, sweet home?" Maya pulled out one earbud, not bothering to return the smile. "Seriously?" Elise sighed and opened the door. The late summer air hit her like a damp cloth, sticky, humid, and thick, with the smell of wild grass and old wood. She popped the trunk and began unloading their life, one box at a time. Inside, the house smelled of dust and memories. Faded floral wallpaper peeled in strips from the walls, and the hardwood floors creaked beneath their feet like they were waking from a long sleep. The furniture was gone, sold years ago after her mother's passing, leaving behind only emptiness and echo. They found an old mattress in the attic and dragged it downstairs, laying it in the middle of the living room. Elise spread out sleeping bags beside it, their only beds for now. Dinner was canned soup heated over a propane burner, eaten by flashlight in the middle of the floor. They laughed once, when Maya accidentally spilled soup on the dog-eared carpet, but even that felt forced. That night, after Maya fell asleep, Elise sat alone in the darkness, staring at the family photo she'd propped up against the dusty mantel. Marcus smiled from behind the glass frame, frozen in time beneath the glow of her old charm bracelet. Wherever he was, she prayed he was safe, and that somehow he could still feel them reaching for him in the dark. The wind pressed against the windows, making the house groan like an old secret. Elise closed her eyes and told herself this was just the beginning. But deep down, something colder whispered that the real fight was only just beginning. Morning came wrapped in thick fog, blurring the edges of the trees and swallowing the distant hills. Elise stood on the porch, her mug of instant coffee cooling in her hands, staring out at a town that didn't feel like hers. She breathed in the quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that watches you from the tree line and waits for you to blink first. They needed supplies, heat, food, and something that didn't expire in 1998. She loaded Maya into the SUV and they drove the winding road into town. Downtown Oak Haven was exactly what she remembered from childhood, and exactly what she'd feared. A single stoplight, a diner with 3 pickup trucks out front, and faces that turned just a little too slow when they saw her. Inside the grocery store, the cashier gave a smile that didn't warm his face. He scanned their bread and canned goods without a word until he handed back her change. "Y'all new here?" he asked flatly. Elise nodded. "Yes, sir. Just moved into the old Morgan place." The smile thinned. Didn't think anyone was still hanging onto that house. Thought it'd be cleared for development by now. She forced a polite chuckle. Guess I'm stubborn. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing else. As they left the store, Elise caught two uniformed deputies standing by the ice machine. They weren't talking to her, but their voices carried loud enough to find her ears. Another one trying to fix what's beyond fixing? Yeah, won't last till Christmas. Maya heard them too. She looked up at her mom, eyes sharp and guarded. Are they talking about us? Elise placed the groceries in the back seat, keeping her voice steady. Let them talk. Words can't touch us. But words, she knew, could shape stories. And in towns like this, stories turned into suspicion fast. The high school wasn't much better. Principal Dunlap greeted them with a handshake that felt like a formality, not a welcome. His office smelled faintly of old carpet and forgotten trophies. He spoke of community, of tradition, of maintaining Oak Haven's special character. We pride ourselves on being a tight-knit school, he said. Diversity is always welcome, as long as it fits in with our values. Elise raised an eyebrow. And what values are those exactly? Dunlap smiled the same way the cashier had. Tight, controlled, hard work, respect, knowing your place. She filed the comment away. She'd heard this song before. After completing the enrollment paperwork, Elise and Maya walked the halls together. Heads turned. Some kids stared openly. Others looked away as if ignoring them might erase them. Back in the car, Maya pulled her hoodie over her head and sighed. I miss Atlanta. Elise started the engine. So do I, baby. But for now, we're here. They drove home in silence, passing fields where nothing stirred but the wind. And somewhere in that quiet stretch between town and home, Elise felt it settle in her chest. This wasn't just a new town. It was a battleground waiting to happen. The third night was when Elise saw it again. That same battered pickup truck rolled past the house just before sundown. Slower this time, deliberate. Its engine growled low, and its headlights flickered like sleepy eyes. She stood by the front window, hands resting on the sill, watching the driver's silhouette disappear behind the bend in the road. It wasn't paranoia. She'd learned to trust her instincts long ago. Someone was watching, measuring her, waiting. And then came the patrol car. It parked across the street the following afternoon, windows tinted dark, engine running like a waiting dog. No one got out. No one knocked. They just sat there, watching the house with quiet menace. Maya noticed it first through the upstairs window. Mommy, she called softly. Are they allowed to just sit there like that? Elise wiped her hands on a towel and joined her daughter at the window. She stared for a long moment, letting the silence hang heavy between them. They'll do what they want until someone tells them they can, Elise said quietly. That's how men like that work. She pulled the curtain closed, but the weight of those tinted windows stayed in the room with them. That evening, Elise and Maya sat on the porch. The crickets chirped from the tall grass, and the wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off. Maya hugged her knees. Do you think it'll ever feel like home? Elise didn't answer right away. She watched the sun slide behind the trees, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. I think we'll have to fight for it, Elise said finally. Some places don't give you peace. You have to carve it out yourself. Maya rested her head against her mother's shoulder, and for a moment, the world was still. But in the back of Elise's mind, she could still hear Marcus's voice from long ago, quiet but clear. Don't mistake quiet for peace. And as the shadows stretched across their worn porch and the cruiser finally pulled away down the darkened road, she knew this town wasn't done with them yet. Not by a long shot. The first letter came on a Monday, folded neatly, taped to the rusted gate out front. Elise found it while taking out the trash, the morning sun barely cutting through the mist. Co-violation. Grass exceeds town ordinance. Height, immediate correction required. There was no department letterhead, just a stamped signature, C. Voss. Elise stared at it for a long minute, her stomach tightening. She scanned the yard, where wildflowers and patches of tall grass swayed in the breeze. Her mother used to call it nature's quilt. Now, apparently, it was a crime scene. She pulled out the old mower from the shed, spent the afternoon sweating in the Carolina heat, cutting every blade of grass down to the root. If they thought they'd catch her slipping, they were wrong. But the next day, another notice appeared. This time it was excessive noise complaint, filed by anonymous resident. Noise? In a house? Where the loudest thing was the kettle whistling in the morning? Elise's jaw tightened. She walked the property, scanning for cameras, microphones, anything. But there was nothing, just the trees and the birds, and the creeping sense that someone, somewhere, was smiling while she spun her wheels. By Wednesday, there were 2 more citations, one for an unregistered outdoor fire pit, and another claiming the structural safety of the front porch steps posed a hazard to community members. No one had even set foot on that porch but her and Maya. When the stack of folded yellow slips hit 5, Elise drove into town. She marched straight into the municipal building, past the sleepy receptionist, and up to the zoning department's counter. A young clerk, no older than 22, looked up from his crossword puzzle. His name said Ryan. "I need to know who filed these violations," Elise said, her voice calm but sharp. Ryan blinked at her, flipping through a thick binder. "Ma'am, everything's anonymous. Community reporting program. We just process what comes in." "From who? The sheriff's department?" Ryan offered a tight smile. "I wouldn't know about that. Maybe try code enforcement." She did, but code enforcement sent her to zoning. Zoning sent her to the town manager. The town manager's secretary said the manager was out for lunch and didn't know when he'd be back. 3 hours later, Eliza sat in her car outside town hall, gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. This was the playbook. Flood her with paperwork, drown her in bureaucracy, wear her down until she broke. But Elise Morgan had lived through worse storms than this. And she wasn't breaking, not yet. In the middle of this quiet war, something unexpected happened. Maya made a friend. It was small at first. A girl named Sarah approached her during science class. They'd been assigned as lab partners for a plant growth experiment. Maya expected the usual awkward silence, but Sarah smiled, warm and easy, and said, "You like anime?" Like it was the most natural question in the world. Caught off guard, Maya smiled back. "Yeah, Full Metal and Attack on Titan." Sarah's grin widened. Finally, someone normal. They spent lunch swapping playlists and laughing about teachers who still called the internet the web. It was the first time Maya had laughed like that in weeks. She told Elise about Sarah over dinner, her voice lighter, brighter, as if for a moment the weight pressing down on their little house had lifted. Elise listened carefully. She wanted to be happy for Maya. God knew her daughter deserved happiness. But when Maya mentioned where Sarah lived, Elise felt the air go cold. "She lives on Red Oak Road," Maya said, biting into a peanut butter sandwich. "Big white house, giant flagpole out front, horses in the back." Elise set her fork down slowly. "Red Oak. Sarah's last name is Voss, isn't it?" Maya paused, nodding. "Yeah. Why?" Elise took a slow breath. Of course, Sarah was the sheriff's niece. She forced a smile. Just curious. Small town. People tend to know each other. But later, when Maya had gone to bed, Elise sat on the porch alone, staring out into the night. Of all the kids Maya could have met, it had to be Sarah Voss, the sheriff's family. She couldn't decide if it was fate or some cruel joke. But she also knew Maya needed this. A friend, a piece of normal. and if she tore that away too soon, Maya would never forgive her. So, Elise did something she wasn't sure was smart. She let it be. Over the next week, Maya spent afternoons at Sarah's house. She'd bike down Red Oak Road, cutting through the fields as the sun hung low in the sky. Eliza always watched her go with a knot in her stomach, counting the minutes until she saw her daughter's hoodie round the bend on the way home. Sarah's family welcomed Maya, at least on the surface. Sarah's mother offered iced tea, and the cook sent them snacks on the porch. It was almost enough to make Elise believe things might stay peaceful. But deep down, she knew better. In towns like this, smiles could be knives in disguise, and anyone who sat too close to the fire eventually got burned. Late one Saturday afternoon, Maya came home later than usual. She dropped her bike by the porch and climbed the steps slowly, her shoulders tense. Elise met her at the door, worry prickling her skin. "Everything okay?" Elise asked. Maya hesitated. Her voice was quiet, guarded. "I think Mr. Voss doesn't like me much." Elise's heart tightened. "What happened?" Maya looked away, as if replaying the moment in her mind. "He just stared at me today. Said something weird. I'll tell you later." Elise nodded slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. But inside, the warning bells had already begun to ring. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the wind barely stirred and the heat clung to your skin like a second shirt. Maya had been sitting on the Voss family's porch, working on a science project with Sarah. They were bent over a textbook, arguing about whether their seedlings would survive in the Carolina heat, when the front door creaked open. Sheriff Clayton Voss stepped outside. The porch fell silent. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his face lined like old leather, and his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his worn hat. Everything about him looked like it belonged to the land, hard, weathered, immovable. At first he didn't say a word, just stood there, watching Maya with that long, measuring stare people used when they'd already decided who you were. Sarah smiled politely. "Uncle Clay, this is Maya. She's my science partner." Voss didn't smile back. He nodded once at Sarah and then said, almost casually, "Sarah, why don't you go inside and grab your aunt's lemonade? Bet you two could use a break." Sarah hesitated, glancing at Maya. "It's fine," Maya said, forcing a smile. "Go ahead." Sarah disappeared inside, and the screen door slammed shut behind her. And then it was just Maya and Voss. He stepped closer, his boots thudding against the old wooden planks. The air felt too thin, too still. "Slow," he said slowly, voice low but steady. "What's your mama really doing out here?" Maya's throat tightened. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, the therapist. Came back to fix up my grandma's house, that's all." Voss smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile you wanted to see. It was the kind that said he'd already made up his mind. The kind that twisted at the edges, sharp and cold. "Therapist, huh? Lot of folks say things about your mama. Hope she's the kind that knows her place." Maya gripped the edge of her chair, her heart pounding. "She's just trying to live in peace, same as anyone else." Voss stared at her a moment longer, then chuckled softly. "Peace, huh? That's cute. But peace don't just happen, little girl. Folks like your mama gotta earn it." The screen door creaked open, and Sarah returned with 2 glasses of lemonade. Voss straightened, tipped his hat without another word, and disappeared back into the house. That night, when Maya told Elise what he'd said, her mother's face went still. She didn't yell, she didn't panic. But in that quiet, Elise knew the game had changed. The sheriff wasn't just watching. He was warning, and the storm was getting closer. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, folded tight and shoved into the mailbox without a stamp, no return address. Elise found it while walking back from the garden with dirt still clinging to her gloves. It was tucked between a hardware store flyer and an overdue electric bill. The paper was thick, heavy, the kind you didn't waste on junk. She opened it on the porch, standing beneath the sagging roof, with the wind tugging at the hem of her shirt. 4 words, no signature. Now, before it gets ugly. No threats, no explanation, just a promise dressed as advice. She read it 3 times, then folded it again and tucked it into the drawer next to her kitchen knives. She didn't show Maya, no point in spreading the fear. It was already thick in the air. That night, Elise lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow above her. She tried to recall the last time she had slept through the night, maybe back in Atlanta, before the hospital layoffs, before her mother's death pulled them back into the past like an undertow. The next morning, something felt off. It wasn't the wind or the clouds. It was quieter than usual, too quiet. Not a single bird call outside the window, not even the rustle of squirrels in the trees. Elise stepped out into the backyard with her coffee, barefoot and alert. Near the back window, something caught her eye. A brick. Wrapped in a piece of newspaper, tucked half-buried in the tall grass beneath Maya's window. She approached slowly, heart pounding with every step. She crouched beside it and peeled back the damp paper. Inside, sealed in a sandwich-sized plastic bag, was something far more dangerous. A small capsule of white powder. Cocaine. Not street trash. Lab clean. Packaged with purpose. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then she stood up, walked back into the house, grabbed a pair of rubber gloves, and sealed the bag and the newspaper in a Ziploc. She labeled it with the date and time, then locked it inside the metal filing cabinet she used for old tax returns. They weren't just watching anymore. They were planting evidence, setting the stage. This wasn't intimidation, it was preparation. Elise stared at the cabinet, chest tight, pulse in her ears. They were building a case. A lie wrapped in silence. And soon, they'd make their move. The next attack came where Elise couldn't protect Maya. It was halfway through 4th period on a Wednesday when a knock came at Maya's classroom door. A counselor she didn't know entered, smiled too brightly, and gestured for her to follow. Maya hesitated, glancing at her teacher, who just nodded like this was normal. But it wasn't. Nothing about this town was normal. They led her down a quiet hall, past the main office, into a small room with pale yellow walls and no windows. Inside, 2 adults sat, waiting, a school resource officer with a badge too large for his chest, and a woman in a blazer who introduced herself as the district wellness coordinator. They didn't ask her how she was doing. They didn't ask if she felt safe. They asked about her mother. "Does your mom ever leave you home alone at night, Maya? Has she ever talked about hurting herself or anyone else? Do you feel scared when you're at home?" The questions came soft but sharp, like blades wrapped in velvet. Maya sat frozen, her stomach twisting into knots. She knew what this was. It wasn't concern. It was an interrogation in disguise. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the tears burning behind her eyes. "My mom's fine. We're just trying to live our life." But the woman smiled like she didn't believe a word. "Sometimes it's hard to admit when things aren't okay, Maya. We're just here to help." She was kept there until the final bell rang. When Elise arrived to pick her up, she found her daughter sitting alone in the front office, arms crossed, eyes dry but distant. The receptionist barely glanced up from her phone. "What happened?" Elise demanded. The principal appeared from his office, expression calm, almost rehearsed. "We received an anonymous concern about Maya's mental health. By law, we had to follow up." "From who?" Elise snapped. He shrugged. "It came through the sheriff's department." The room went still. Elise's jaw tightened. "We're just doing our duty," the principal said, his voice void of warmth. Duty, that word again, the one people used when they wanted to wash their hands of what they'd done. Elise placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We're leaving." She led her daughter out of that office without looking back, but inside something cold settled in her chest. They weren't just threatening her now. They were coming after her child. The next few days passed like walking through wet cement. Elise could feel the weight of eyes on her everywhere she went. At the grocery store, the whispers began before she even crossed the threshold. "Is that her?" "Yeah, that's the one with the drugs." "Earth, poor kid. Sheriff's keeping an eye on him." They didn't bother lowering their voices. In a town this small, rumors traveled faster than truth ever could. Elise kept her head high, scanning the shelves for cereal and milk, while her heart pounded like a war drum. At checkout, the cashier rang up her items without a word. Not even the tight smile from last week. Just silence. Cold, suffocating silence. As she walked to her car, a man in a truck rolled down his window and spat on the pavement. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She slammed the trunk shut harder than she meant to, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. Not here. Not now. Driving home, Maya sat quietly beside her, her earbuds in, but Elise knew she felt it too. The isolation, the judgment. At the post office it was the same. Faces turned away. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when she walked in. People who had once known her mother, who used to wave from their porches when Elise was just a girl, now refused to meet her gaze. Even the church bulletin board had been updated. A flyer for the annual harvest fair now read, "Families welcome, good honest fun for good honest folks." The message wasn't subtle. But the silence of her neighbors wasn't what cut the deepest. It was their fear. Fear to speak. Fear to stand beside her. They had all made the calculation. Staying quiet was safer. Elise understood it, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. One night, as the sun dipped low over the hills, she stepped onto the porch and looked across the fields. Mr. Bailey, her nearest neighbor, stood by his fence smoking a pipe. For a moment, their eyes met. She gave him a slight nod, an olive branch across the distance. But Bailey just turned away, his back stiff, his shoulders hunched as if shielding himself from something unseen. That was when it hit her. They weren't ignoring her because they hated her. They were ignoring her because they were terrified of what Sheriff Voss might do to anyone who helped her. This wasn't just about property lines or drug accusations anymore. This was about power, quiet, suffocating power that kept a whole town in line. Elise stood alone on that porch, the breeze brushing her hair, the sky painted in bruised purples and fading gold. And in that silence, she made a promise to herself. She would not run, she would not break, but she would prepare. Because men like Voss didn't stop until they met something stronger than fear. And that something was coming. It was still dark when Elise woke, the kind of dark that felt thicker than night itself, pressing against the windows and filling every corner of the house. She pulled on her robe, careful not to wake Maya, and made her way to the kitchen. The house groaned softly in the wind, its old bones shifting against the cold. Elise filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and lit the burner with a soft click. The blue flame hissed to life, casting long shadows on the faded linoleum floor. She stood there, rubbing her arms against the chill, listening to the quiet whistle of the wind outside. It was almost peaceful, almost. But the quiet had a sharpness to it this morning, a warning edge. The kettle began to hum. She reached for her chipped mug, the one with a faded lighthouse painted on its side, when the silence shattered. 3 thunderous bangs shook the front door, loud enough to make the entire house tremble. "Hearst Department, open up." Before Elise could even take a step, the door exploded inward with a crack like gunfire, wood splintering across the floor. She stumbled back, heart slamming against her ribs. Flashlights cut through the dark, blinding her. "Hands up! Hands where we can see them!" Voices barked, sharp and fast. Elise raised her arms instinctively, her voice shaking. "I have a child in the house. Please, don't scare her. We're unarmed." But they weren't listening. 3 deputies in tactical gear stormed the living room, boots stomping over their sleeping bags and battered furniture. One of them pinned Elise against the wall, twisting her arm behind her back before she could even speaking. "Why is this?" she gasped. "Where's your warrant?" she cried. And no answer. Sheriff Clayton Voss stepped through the broken doorway last, slow and steady, like a man surveying a battlefield he already owned. He wore a sheriff's vest, his badge catching the beam of the flashlights. His face was calm, almost bored. "Ms. Morgan," he said, voice low, "you're under investigation for possession and distribution of controlled substances." Elise stared at him, her mind spinning. "That's a lie," she hissed. "You know it's a lie." Voss just smiled. "Search the house," he ordered, waving a hand. The deputies scattered like wolves loosed from a cage, tearing through cabinets, drawers, even the floorboards, looking for something or planting it. And somewhere behind them in the hallway, Maya stirred awake. Elise turned her head toward the stairs. "No," she screamed. "Stay in your room." But the chaos drowned out her voice. And Maya was already coming down. Maya's bare feet slapped against the hardwood floor, her heart pounding before she even saw what was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She heard her mother's voice first, sharp and panicked, cutting through the chaos. "Stay upstairs, baby. Don't come down." But it was too late. The beam of a flashlight caught her mid-step, blinding her. Maya froze halfway down the stairs, squinting through the harsh glare. And that's when one of the deputies turned, already on edge, his weapon raised. "Movement in the hallway," he shouted. "No!" Elise screamed, her voice breaking apart. "That's my daughter. She's a child." But fear was faster than reason. The deputy fired. One shot cracked through the room like thunder, echoing off the walls. Maya fell backward, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as the bullet struck her side. Her body crumpled to the floor at the foot of the stairs, limbs limp, her pink t-shirt blooming red in seconds. The world stopped spinning. For a moment, there was no sound but Elise's scream, raw and guttural, ripping through the chaos like a blade. The deputy froze, his face pale beneath his helmet. He stammered, lowering his weapon. I thought—" She moved too fast. "I didn't see—" Voss turned, his face like stone. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He spoke calmly, like a man used to controlling the aftermath. "Secure the scene. No witnesses outside this room." Another deputy crouched beside Maya, checked her pulse. Still breathing, weak but alive. "Child Americ," someone muttered. But no one moved. Because that wasn't the plan. The plan wasn't to help. The plan was to finish. Voss looked down at Elise, who was now on her knees, cuffed and trembling, her voice hoarse from screaming. "You brought this on yourself," he said coldly. "You shot my baby," Elise choked out. "She was a child, a child." But Voss had already turned away, barking orders to keep searching, keep planting, keep controlling the story. In that moment, Elise realized something bone deep. They weren't going to stop. Not until they buried her under lies. Until the town believed whatever story Sheriff Voss fed them. And Maya, bleeding and broken, was just collateral damage. Elise struggled against the handcuffs, wrists burning, heart screaming louder than her voice ever could. But no one listened. The deputies moved with cold precision, flipping sofa cushions, tearing through kitchen drawers, leaving chaos in their wake. And then Voss gave the quiet signal, a nod, subtle, practiced. One deputy peeled away from the group and walked straight to the kitchen freezer. He wore black tactical gloves and carried a small duffel bag that looked far too familiar. Elise watched in horror, powerless to stop him. He opened the freezer door, shifted the bags of frozen vegetables, and tucked a small, plastic-wrapped brick beneath the ice tray. Cocaine. Exactly what they needed to seal her fate. Her voice cracked through the chaos. "Don't you dare!" But the deputy didn't even glance her way. Voss stepped closer, crouching to meet her eye level, his voice low, almost gentle. "Now we have a story," he said, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something colder. Single mother, out of work, dealing drugs to make ends meet. Daughter caught in the crossfire of her bad decisions. Tragic, really, but it'll play well on the evening news. Elise shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling from rage and fear. "People will see the truth." Voss gave a thin smile, the kind that made your skin crawl. "People see what I tell them to see." And just like that, the game was done. "Bring her out," Voss ordered. Two deputies yanked Elise to her feet, dragging her through the broken doorway and out into the cold dawn. Her feet were bare against the splintered porch, her nightshirt stained with dust and her daughter's blood. Across the street, the neighbors stood in doorways and on porches, some with coffee mugs, some with crossed arms, all pretending this wasn't happening right in front of them. They do a wave. They didn't speak. They just watched. The deputies shoved Elise into the back of a cruiser, her wrists still cuffed behind her. She twisted to look back at the house, heart pounding against the walls of her chest. The front door stood wide open, and there, through the frame, she could just barely see Maya's body on the floor, motionless, blood soaking the hard wood. And then something worse. The paramedics arrived, but they didn't rush. They didn't run. They walked in slow, calculated steps, like men arriving at a scene they'd already decided the outcome of. Elise screamed again, her voice raw and broken. "Help her, she's just a child. Help her." But no one listened. The cruiser door slammed shut, cutting her off from the world outside. Inside the car, the engine rumbled to life, and the radio crackled with Sheriff Voss's voice, calm and clinical. Suspect in custody. Evidence secured. Minor injured during attempted evasion. House secure. The words stabbed into her chest like knives. He was already rewriting the story. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the cruiser pulled away from the house, Elise pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the only home she had left disappear behind her. And for the first time in years, she felt truly alone. But deep down, beneath the layers of fear and heartbreak, something else stirred. Rage. And if she knew Marcus, her husband, her soldier, then he was going to feel that rage too. And when he did, God help anyone who stood in his way. At 5:42 a.m., Marcus Morgan wrapped his fists in black tape, the cold New Mexico air sharp against his skin. The training room lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He'd been working the heavy bag for nearly an hour, strikes sharp, precise, relentless. This was where he kept his demons quiet. Until the phone buzzed against the metal bench. He wiped the sweat from his brow and checked the caller ID. Clay Worthington, old friend, former recon, never called without a reason. Marcus answered without hesitation. Clay's voice was low, urgent. "Something went down in Oakhaven, Marcus. It's bad." Marcus felt the world slow. "What happened?" "I'm sending you the link now. Local news broke it first. Nationals picking it up." Marcus opened the message. The thumbnail alone told him everything. A screenshot of Elise, barefoot, in handcuffs, blood on her nightshirt, being shoved into the back of a sheriff's cruiser. The caption read, "Local woman arrested in drug raid, teen critically injured in alleged crossfire." Marcus's chest tightened like a vice. He turned up the volume. The news anchor's voice was too calm. Authorities responded to an early morning tip involving suspected narcotics activity, at a residence outside town limits. One juvenile was injured during the operation. The investigation is ongoing. No names, no facts, just enough to cover themselves. But Marcus knew the playbook. He could read between the lines. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a takedown, a setup. He stood still for a long moment, the weight of the news sinking into his bones. Then he wrapped his hands tighter, feeling the sting in his knuckles, the steady rhythm of his pulse reminding him that he was still breathing and still dangerous. He closed the app, set the phone down gently, and stared at the heavy bag hanging in front of him. For a split second, the room felt too quiet. Then he swung hard, sending the bag flying backward like it weighed nothing. Marcus exhaled slow and steady. They thought they could break his family while he was gone. They thought wrong. Without a word, he untaped his hands, wiped the sweat from his neck, and walked to the locker room. By the time the sun rose over the desert, Marcus Morgan was already moving. And nothing in Oak Haven would ever be the same again. Marcus didn't panic. He didn't rant. He prepared. First, he wiped his digital footprint. Phone wiped. Accounts deleted. His location history erased like footprints in the desert sand. Then, he opened his gear locker, the one that hadn't been touched in months. Inside was everything he needed, and nothing he didn't. A .45 caliber sidearm, field cleaned, and wrapped in oilcloth. 2 burner phones, prepaid and untraceable. Tactical gloves. Civilian clothing, built for utility, not fashion. And a thumb drive containing a full dossier on local law enforcement corruption in rural counties, something he'd been compiling long before Oak Haven ever came calling. Marcus packed fast but methodically. Each movement was efficient, practiced. His mind cataloged each step like a mission briefing. Only this time, the mission wasn't foreign soil. It was home. He grabbed his keys and locked the door to the small cinder-block apartment the Army had leased him for temporary duty. Then, for good measure, he left his official Delta Force credentials in the mailbox. If command came looking for him, they'd have to ask why. In the truck, he powered up one of the burner phones and made the call. Clay answered on the first ring. "You moving?" Clay asked. "Already gone," Marcus said. "I need intel on Voss and his department. I want to know who works nights, who takes bribes, who talks too much at the bar." Clay exhaled, the sound crackling over the line. "I've got a guy. Jimmy Klein, runs a garage in the next county. Used to be a reserve deputy before Voss forced him out. He hears things. Send me his location. I'll be there by nightfall." "And Marcus," Clay's voice softened just slightly, "this isn't your usual op. No extraction team, no chain of command." "I know," Marcus said, voice steady. "That's why it'll work." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The sun hung low behind him as he crossed into Texas, tires eating miles of highway like a man running out of time. The mission was simple: find Elise, protect Maya, expose Voss, burn down anyone who stood in his way. Marcus had been trained for war, but this time the battlefield wore her a badge and smiled for local news cameras. And they had no idea what was coming for them. By the time Marcus crossed into North Carolina, night had fallen, wrapping the back roads in thick shadows and cold silence. The stars overhead blinked through patches of mist, but Marcus kept his eyes forward, scanning for unmarked patrol cars and late-night roadblocks. He wasn't just coming home. He was coming for war. The town of Oak Haven looked unchanged from the last time he'd seen it, years ago, when he and Elise drove through on a lazy summer afternoon. But now, every porch light felt like an interrogation lamp, every empty driveway like a warning. He parked his truck outside a closed gas station 2 towns over and killed the lights. Then he opened the glove box and pulled out a battered notebook Elise had given him when they first married. Inside were scribbled notes about the property, boundary lines, power easements, old family friends. and the names of people who could be trusted. That list was short. Marcus flipped to a blank page and began sketching out his approach. First, find Elise, confirm she was alive, then get to Maya. He knew hospitals in towns like this weren't safe, especially when the sheriff's men controlled the doors. And when they were safe, when they were breathing and protected, that's when the real work would begin. He started with Jimmy Klein. The garage sat at the end of a dirt road, lights off except for a faint bulb glowing behind the bay doors. Marcus approached slow, hands visible, but every step measured. He didn't have the luxury of surprise. Yet, Jimmy met him at the door, wiping grease from his hands on an old rag. His eyes scanned Marcus once, sharp and wary. "You Marcus Morgan?" Jimmy asked, voice low. "I am," Marcus said. "I heard what they did to your wife and kid," Jimmy said, stepping aside to let him in. "Whole damn town's been whispering about it, but no one's doing a damn thing." "Then I guess it's time someone did," Marcus replied. Inside, the garage smelled of oil and rust, but on the workbench sat something far more useful, an old police scanner and a dusty county map, littered with pens and scribbled notes. Jimmy pointed to a marked intersection. "Voss's boys patrol in shifts, but there's gaps. They get lazy around midnight. And there's a supply run scheduled for tomorrow. Someone's moving evidence from the department to the county lockup." Marcus leaned in, studying the routes. "Think I can intercept it?" Jimmy gave a thin smile. "If you're careful. If you're not, well, they'll make sure you disappear like the others." Marcus nodded, the weight of it settling on his shoulders like armor. He was used to being outnumbered, used to taking the hard road. And this one, it was personal. He spent the rest of the night driving the outskirts of town, memorizing street layouts, noting every alley, every exit, every shadow. He drove past his own house. The lights were off. The crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze like a ghost's warning. He could still see the scorch marks from the raid on the front porch. He sat there, engine idling, staring at the house that was supposed to be their sanctuary. Then he pulled away, slipping back into the night. Tomorrow would be the first strike, quiet, precise. But tonight he allowed himself one moment of grief. One moment to miss Elise's laugh, Maya's stubborn grin, the life they were supposed to have. Then he set his jaw and drove into the dark. Because men like Voss thought they had already won. But Marcus Morgan was just getting started. The next night, beneath the hum of flickering garage lights, Marcus met the first man willing to stand beside him. Jimmy Klein wasn't what you'd call a hero. He was rough around the edges, oil-stained and battle-weary from a lifetime of watching power crush people who couldn't fight back. But when Marcus explained what Voss had done to Elise and Maya, Jimmy's jaw tightened like a man who'd waited too long to strike back. "You're not the first they've tried to bury," Jimmy said, sliding a battered laptop across the workbench. "But maybe you'll be the first who digs them out." Jimmy had built something in secret, a back door into the sheriff's department's surveillance feeds. Years ago, when he worked as a reserve deputy, he'd been tasked with wiring the station's internal cameras. What they didn't know was that Jimmy had kept access, a failsafe, a way to watch the watchers. Marcus leaned over his shoulder as the grainy feeds came to life on the laptop screen. What they saw chilled them both. There was Sheriff Voss in his office, laughing over whiskey as he signed off on property seizure orders. Deputies passing around bags of white powder, labeled evidence, before they were ever logged into the system. Patrol cars meeting with men in business suits in the middle of the night, exchanging envelopes and handshakes. But it was what they saw next that made Marcus's blood run cold. A time-stamped video feed from Elise's house. Not from the raid, but from 2 nights before. A deputy slipping through the back gate under cover of darkness. He knelt by the window and carefully tucked the Ziploc bag of cocaine beneath the siding. Then he walked away, hands clean. "Jimmy," whisper, The setup. Marcus stared at the screen, rage boiling beneath his skin. How long have they been doing this? Years, Jimmy said. Most folks never fight back. They either sell or disappear. Jimmy clicked open another file. Dozens of property seizure forms, all signed by Voss or his cronies. Most of the homes belonged to black families, single mothers and elderly landowners holding on to their property for generations. This ain't just corruption, Jimmy said quietly. It's theft. Slow, systematic theft. Marcus sat back, heart pounding. The raid on Elise wasn't personal. It was business. Cold, calculated business. She had what they wanted. Land, legacy, something they could turn into profit if she was forced out. He looked Jimmy in the eye. We're going to burn them for this. Jimmy gave a thin smile, tired but real. Then let's light the match. With the first proof in hand, Marcus and Jimmy moved fast. Marcus knew better than to trust official channels. Ruskell's reach ran deep. But every system, no matter how corrupt, had cracks. That crack was named Detective Marcus Hayes. Hayes had been a ghost in his own department for years, an old-school detective with a reputation for digging into places he wasn't supposed to. Word was, Hayes had tried to open cases on Voss before, bribery, unlawful seizures, illegal surveillance, but his reports always got lost. Now he worked cold cases and internal audits, stuck in a basement office with a flickering light bulb and a coffee machine that hadn't brewed anything fresh since the Obama administration. Marcus found him at his desk, flipping through faded case files. His tie loosened and his eyes tired. "Detective Hayes," Marcus said, stepping into the doorway. Hayes looked up, unimpressed. "Who the hell are you?" "Elise Morgan's husband," Marcus replied, voice steady. "And I've got what you've been looking for." That got Hayes's attention. He gestured to a chair, closed the door. Marcus laid out everything: the surveillance footage, the falsified code violations, the staged drug evidence. Hayes watched in silence, leaning back with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When Marcus finished, the room sat in thick silence. Hayes finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "Buy-in and nail Voss for 6 years. Every lead dries up, every witness disappears, and every time I thought I had him cornered, some state official would call me off. You're telling me you've got him on tape planting evidence on your wife's property?" Marcus nodded once. "And that's just the start." Hayes rubbed his temples, letting out a slow breath. "You understand what you're stepping into, right? Voss isn't the king. He's the gatekeeper. Behind him are developers, investors, and half the county commissioners. They've been laundering land through shell companies for years, turning family homes into industrial parks, luxury cabins, and private hunting reserves. "I don't care who's behind him," Marcus said. "I'm burning the whole tree, roots and all." Hayes gave a tired smile. "I can help you, but this isn't a courtroom play. It's leverage, public pressure. You expose them in the court of public opinion first, then let the law catch up when the tide turns." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Then we start now." Hayes slid open his drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder marked "Confidential." Inside were sealed complaints, ghosted property transfers, and sealed testimony from families who had been forced out over the past decade. He tossed it on the desk between them. "You're not the first to fight this war, Morgan," Hayes said, "but maybe you'll be the first to finish it." Marcus picked up the folder, feeling the weight of every life Voss had tried to bury. "Where do we start?" he asked. Hayes cracked a rare grin. "Tomorrow's county meeting, public forum. Voss has to address the property acquisitions. You leak this right before it starts, you'll have every reporter in the Triangle area knocking down his door." Marcus stood. "Then tomorrow the town wakes up." The next morning, Oak Haven woke to the story they weren't ready to hear. Marcus worked through the night with Hayes and Jimmy, pulling together the surveillance clips, the property theft records, and sworn statements from displaced families. At dawn, he sent everything to a contact Clay had lined up, a regional journalist named Andre Pierce, known for exposing corruption in sleepy southern towns. Andre didn't waste a second. By 7:00 a.m. the headline was live. Sheriff accused of systemic land theft. Leaked footage reveals evidence. Planting cover. The article spread like wildfire. Local forums lit up. Facebook posts circulated screenshots of Voss in his office, laughing over forged property seizure orders. Anonymous users leaked video stills of deputies slipping onto Elisa's property, planting the cocaine. By 8:30 a.m., reporters from 3 counties had converged on the Oak Haven courthouse steps. Their cameras pointed at the building where the county commissioners were scheduled to meet. And Voss, he had no choice but to show up. He arrived with his usual swagger, surrounded by deputies, wearing the same calm mask he always wore. But beneath that sheriff's badge, his hands twitched. The cracks were showing. The town square, once silent in fear, was filled with something different now. Whispers of outrage, questions too loud to ignore. Marcus watched from across the street, blending into the crowd in a worn hoodie and faded jeans. No one recognized him. No one knew yet that the man who tore open this scandal was standing among them, watching the flames rise. Inside the courthouse, Voss tried to regain control. He called the accusations fabricated nonsense, blamed outside agitators, and painted himself as the victim of a personal vendetta. But then, Andre stepped forward, holding a printed copy of the surveillance footage in one hand and the property theft records in the other. Voss, are these signatures yours? Voss froze. For the first time, his voice faltered. No comment at this time. The room exploded in noise. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashed, and the commissioner, some pale, some visibly sweating, began whispering among themselves. The facade had cracked. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just turned and walked away, leaving the fire to burn. But this was only the first blow. The men behind Voss, the developers, the politicians, the money men, they were still hiding in the shadows. And Marcus was coming for them next. Marcus didn't need force to take Voss down. He needed something far more dangerous. Voss's pride. Sitting in Jimmy's garage with the surveillance feeds flickering beside him, Marcus and Detective Hayes mapped out the final strike. They didn't have time for court subpoenas or public forums. They needed a confession, raw, unfiltered, the kind of truth no lawyer could bear. So they set a trap. It started with a rumor, seeded carefully in the places Voss trusted most. Hayes made the first call to an old informant in the sheriff's office, just loud enough to be overheard in the squad room. Jimmy fed the story to a couple of mechanics at the diner, who passed it along like gossip over coffee. The story was simple. Elise Morgan had escaped custody during a transfer and was hiding in the old textile warehouse on the edge of town, angry, armed, ready to blow the whole story open. Voss took the bait by noon. He didn't call for backup. He didn't log the operation. That would leave a paper trail. Instead, he gathered Deputy Raymond Drew, the same rookie who pulled the trigger on Maya, and loaded up an unmarked SUV. They left without sirens, slipping through the back streets like shadows. Just the two of them, no witnesses. Exactly what Marcus wanted. Meanwhile, Marcus and Hayes spent the afternoon rigging the warehouse. Every beam, every corner, every entryway lined with wireless cameras and directional microphones Jimmy had scavenged from an old security job. Marcus knew how to build a perimeter, knew how to control the ground. The warehouse itself was the perfect stage, abandoned, sprawling, with enough empty corners and steel walkways to disappear into. The perfect place for a sheriff to bury a secret. Or so Voss thought. Marcus stood in the rafters as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows swallowing the floor below. Hayes sat in a monitoring van down the road, feeds pulled up on a bank of screens, every angle covered. "Showtime," Marcus whispered, checking the battery on his headset. At 9:47 p.m., headlights cut through the broken windows. The SUV rolled to a stop outside the loading dock. 2 doors opened. Heavy boots hit the gravel. Sheriff Clayton Voss stepped into the darkness, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other. Deputy Drew followed close behind, twitchy and pale, his guilt dragging behind him like a shadow. "Let's make this clean," Voss muttered, his voice sharp, cold. "No loose ends this time." They stepped inside, unaware they were walking into the storm. The warehouse swallowed their footsteps, every echo magnified by the cavernous emptiness. Dust floated through the air, catching the weak beam of Voss's flashlight. "Spread out," Voss barked. "Find her." Drew hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his sidearm. "Sheriff, what if someone else is here? What if this is a setup?" Voss shot him a sharp look, one that could cut through concrete. "You want her talking to the press? You want your face splashed all over the 6 o'clock news for shooting a kid?" Drew swallowed hard, his throat dry. "No, sir." "Then shut up and move." They pushed deeper into the shadows, weaving between rusted machinery and broken pallets. What they didn't know was that every word they spoke bounced through microphones tucked into the rafters, every movement captured by silent cameras perched above. Up in the catwalks, Marcus followed them like a ghost, his footsteps silent, his breath steady. He tracked their positions, feeding updates to Hayes over the comm. "Drew's cracking," Marcus whispered. "Voss is forcing the pace. They'll slip soon." In the monitoring van, Hayes leaned closer to the screens, his jaw tight. "Copy that. Hold position, let 'em talk." Down below, Drew stopped beside an overturned crate, his nerves finally snapping. "This ain't right, Sheriff. We shot her kid. We planted dope. This was supposed to scare her, not kill her." Voss spun on him, furious. "You think you're some kind of hero now. You were in it the second you pulled that trigger. There's no going back." Drew shook his head, voice shaking. "You said it was clean. You said we'd just push her out." Voss lowered his flashlight, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Nobody forced you to pull that trigger, Ray. But if you want this to disappear, you finish what you started. Otherwise, you're the one who goes down. You, not me." And there it was. The confession. Marcus signaled to Hayes. "We've got it." Hayes keyed his mic to the state investigators listening on the other end. "Green light, move in, now." Suddenly, the warehouse exploded with floodlights. From every entrance, figures in tactical vests stormed. In-state Bureau of Investigation, Internal Affairs, even federal observers. "Sheriff Clayton Voss, drop your weapon. Deputy Drew, on your knees. Hands where we can see them." Voss spun, eyes wide with shock. For the first time, his confidence cracked. "What the hell is this?" he roared. "You can't do this. I'm the law here." But no one listened. Drew's weapon clattered to the ground as he dropped to his knees, hands raised, tears already streaking his face. Voss tried to speak, but his words drowned beneath the roar of orders and the click of cuffs snapping closed around his wrists. Marcus watched from the shadows, heart pounding, but calm. The trap had sprung, and the hunt was far from over. The bright warehouse lights flickered as more officers poured in, their radios crackling, boots thudding against the concrete floor. For the first time in his career, Sheriff Clayton Voss found himself staring down the barrels of guns he didn't control. He stood frozen in the center of the room, his badge hanging heavy on his chest, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're making a mistake," Voss growled, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "I run this town. You're nothing but outsiders." A senior internal affairs agent stepped forward, calm and cold. "Not anymore, Sheriff. The evidence is live. You've been recorded. Every word, every threat, every crime." Drew, still on his knees, broke down completely. "I didn't mean to. I just followed orders." He said we had to scare her off the property. Said nobody would care if she disappeared. "Shut up," Voss shouted, his voice cracking for the first time. But it was too late. The truth was already out. Hayes had been streaming the entire raid through a secured feed, broadcasting it to state prosecutors and regional media outlets waiting for confirmation. By morning, there would be no walking this back. Marcus remained in the shadows, unseen by the men he'd hunted. He listened as Voss cursed, bargaining, threatening, and finally breaking beneath the weight of his own arrogance. The senior agent continued. "You led a criminal conspiracy to force private families off their land. You fabricated evidence, falsified reports, and endangered a child's life. You'll answer for every piece of it." Voss sneered, his bravado collapsing in pieces. "This won't stick. I've got friends in Raleigh. They'll bury this." But even as he spoke, Marcus knew those friends were already watching the footage, scrambling to distance themselves from the sinking ship. No one would save Voss now. He wasn't an asset anymore. He was a liability. The cuffs clicked shut around Voss's wrists, tighter this time. Drew was escorted out first, head bowed, face pale as death. He had been the trigger man, but now he was the one begging for mercy. Voss was next, his shoulders finally sagging under the weight of defeat. As they dragged him out, Marcus allowed himself one brief glance downward. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just closure. The trap had worked. But deep down, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. Voss was a symptom. The disease still ran through the county, through the developers, the politicians, the boardroom sharks who saw families like his as obstacles, not people. As the last of the agents cleared the warehouse, Marcus slipped back into the night. No fanfare, no applause, just quiet footsteps and cold resolve. The war wasn't won, but the first battle was over, and the hunters had just become the hunted. The courthouse smelled of dust and nerves. Oakhaven hadn't seen a trial this big in decades. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras lowered but ready. Town elders sat stiff in the gallery, hands folded like they could pray the truth away. But no one's prayers would stop what was coming. Marcus, Elise, and Maya took their seats in the front row. Maya's wheelchair was parked beside Elise, her small frame wrapped in a navy blazer that drowned her shoulders, but made her look like a soldier going into battle. Marcus sat beside them, his expression carved from stone. The prosecution wasted no time. Detective Hayes was first to take the stand. His voice was calm, steady. Each word a nail driven straight into the coffin of Voss's career. He laid out the surveillance footage from the warehouse sting, the falsified warrants, the planted evidence at Elise's home. On the screen behind him, the jury watched in stunned silence as Voss barked orders to Drew in the warehouse, his voice echoing across the speakers. "Loose ends. Finish what you started." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the defense attorney, a sharp-suited man from Raleigh, couldn't hide his unease. Next came Cassandra Lowe, the paralegal who uncovered the paper trail. She spoke in rapid, precise terms, laying out the web of property seizures, shell companies, and illegal zoning ordinances that had stripped black families of their land for generations. She finished with one final blow, the forged complaint that had triggered the raid on Elise's home. A complaint signed not by a citizen, but by an alias linked directly to Voss's private holdings. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom was suffocating in its own silence. The judge, a silver-haled woman with tired eye, called for a recess, but no one left. No one could move. Elise sat there, hands gripping Maya's shoulder gently, tears stinging her eyes but refusing to fall. For so long, this town had treated them like ghosts. Now, they were undeniable. When the break ended, the judge called for the next witness. Her voice was soft but clear. "The court calls Maya Morgan." A hush fell over the room. Marcus squeezed his daughter's hand once, gently. Maya nodded and wheeled herself forward. And for the first time since the bullet tore through her side, she was ready to speak. The courtroom held its breath as Maya rolled to the witness stand. The bailiff helped her swear in, his hands shaking just slightly as he lowered the Bible toward her. Maya placed her hand on it and met the judge's gaze, steady and unflinching. The prosecutor approached gently, voice softer than before. "Can you tell us what happened the morning of the raid?" Maya drew a deep breath. Her voice was quiet but strong. "I woke up to yelling. I didn't know what was happening. I just heard my mom screaming for me to stay in my room." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I was scared. I didn't listen. I thought she needed me." A tear rolled down her cheek, but her voice didn't break. "When I stepped out, the lights blinded me, and then they shot me." The words dropped like stones in a pond, ripples of shock spreading through the crowd. The prosecutor gave her a moment, then asked, "Did you have a weapon in your hands, Maya?" She shook her head. "I wasn't holding anything. I wasn't a threat. I was just a kid trying to protect my mom." In the back of the room, a reporter dropped his pen. Several jurors wiped their eyes. Then the prosecutor asked, "Do you recognize the person who fired the shot?" Maya slowly turned her head toward Deputy Raymond Drew. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Drew couldn't look away. "It was him," she said, her voice steady as stone. Drew's face crumpled. He lowered his head into his hands, shoulders shaking. The prosecutor nodded gently. "Thank you, Maya." Then something no one expected. "Can I say one more thing?" she asked. The judge nodded. Maya turned to face the gallery, scanning the faces of the people who had whispered behind her back in grocery store aisles and gas stations. The people who crossed the street when she walked by. She looked them in the eyes, one by one. "You thought we were trash," she said, voice soft but sharp. "You thought we didn't belong here. But my family has lived on that land for 3 generations, and when you tried to break us, you made us stronger." She paused, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. "Mom didn't give up, my dad didn't run, and I'm still here." The silence was deafening. For the first time since the raid, the townspeople saw the Morgans not as suspects, but as survivors. Not as enemies, but as proof that no lie, no badge, no amount of power could erase their story. Maya rolled herself back to her parents. Elise caught her in a tearful embrace. Marcus placed a steady hand on both their shoulders. The tide had turned, but the verdict still lay ahead. The courtroom sat in breathless silence as the judge called for closing arguments. The defense tried to salvage what little they could, spinning a story about duty, confusion, and unfortunate mistakes. But their words fell flat in the shadow of the video evidence, the paper trail, and the voices that had finally been heard. When the prosecutor rose to speak, she didn't deliver a speech. She spoke plainly, letting the facts do what Voss had tried so hard to bury. Power without accountability is a loaded weapon. Sheriff Voss didn't just fail this town, he betrayed it, and Deputy Drew, in his fear, pulled the trigger on a child. She turned to the jury. "The law doesn't ask us to be perfect, but it does ask us to be honest. Today, I ask you to return this town to truth." The judge gave final instructions, then the jury filed out. The room held its collective breath. Marcus sat between Elise and Maya, their hands intertwined. His chest rose and fell slowly, not in fear, but in readiness. Minutes dragged into hours. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his voice firm. "On the charge of conspiracy to falsify evidence against Elise Morgan, we find the defendant, Sheriff Clayton Voss, guilty." The words echoed like thunder through the chamber. "Reckless endangerment resulting in bodily harm. We find the defendant, Deputy Raymond Drew, guilty." One by one, the charges were read, each one followed by the same word, guilty. When the final count was announced, the courtroom fell silent. not out of shock, but from something deeper: relief, a crack in the silence that had ruled Oak Haven for too long. The judge's gavel struck once. Sentencing would come later, but the verdict spoke volumes. Voss sat motionless, jaw clenched, his power slipping through his fingers like dust. Drew broke down, his shoulders heaving with sobs, the weight of his guilt finally crashing down. Across the room, Elise let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She pulled Maya close, burying her face in her daughter's hair. Marcus sat back, shoulders finally relaxing, but there was no smile. He knew this was just one battle in a war far from over. As the courtroom emptied, townspeople approached quietly. Some nodded. A few offered whispered apologies. Others just watched, realizing for the first time what their silence had cost. Outside, the courthouse steps filled with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning in a summer storm. But Marcus, Elise, and Maya didn't stop for interviews. They walked past them all, hand in hand. Because the story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And tomorrow, they'd start writing the next chapter. The trial was over, but Marcus knew the war had only just begun. Sheriff Voss was never the real power. He was a pawn, an arrogant, brutal pawn, but still just a piece on someone else's board. 3 days after the verdict, Marcus met with Judge Hollis Reed and Cassandra Lowe in a weathered cabin outside of town. The sun was setting beyond the tree line, casting long shadows across the cracked floorboards as they spread files across the table. "What do we know so far?" Reed asked, rubbing his tired eyes. Cassandra pulled out a thick folder marked with one name: Harlan Grove Holdings. This company has been buying up land all across the county under fake names and shell corporations, she explained. Their acquisitions line up perfectly with every raid, every false code violation, every family that got pushed out. Reed flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper. This isn't just Oak Haven. This is statewide. Cassandra nodded grimly. And all the roads lead back to one man, Edmund Stratton, former lobbyist turned real estate tycoon, quiet, powerful, and completely invisible to the public eye. Marcus leaned forward, scanning the data. Harlan Grove wasn't a real business in the usual sense. No public offices, no board of directors, just a web of shell companies and offshore accounts stretching from North Carolina to Delaware to the Cayman Islands. Stratton funds the politicians who write the zoning laws, Cassandra said. He hires private security firms that act like shadow police, and he bankrolls sheriffs like Voss to clear the land when families won't sell. Reed exhaled slowly, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. It's bigger than we thought. Marcus's jaw tightened. It always is. For years, Stratton and his network had operated in the shadows, their crimes buried beneath paperwork and sealed court records. Families like the Morgans were nothing but speed bumps in their path to profit. But not anymore. Marcus tapped the table. We expose Stratton, publicly, and then we take apart Harlan Grove Holdings piece by piece. Reed nodded. Careful though. Men like him don't go down without a fight. He'll have lawyers, lobbyists, maybe even politicians in his pocket. Cassandra met Marcus's gaze, fire burning in her eyes. Then we fight smarter. They mapped out a plan, data leaks, legal petitions, federal referrals, but Marcus knew it would take more than paper and press conferences. It would take war. But tonight, as the last of the sun faded, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet. He looked out the window toward the distant lights of Oak Haven and whispered the promise he had carried since the raid. I'll finish this, all of it. By the end of the week, Oak Haven wasn't just a local headline, it was national news. Andre Pierce published the first full expose in the early hours of Monday morning. The title alone made waves. A sheriff's badge became a developer's weapon, the untold story of Oakhaven's land theft. Within hours, it trended across every major social platform. Photos of Elise's bullet-riddled home and Maya's quiet strength in the witness chair became rallying cries. And then, Andre dropped the bombshell. He published the entire Harlan Grove Holdings network, its shell companies, its hidden investors, and its documented ties to county commissioners across 4 states. Screenshots showed emails from Edmund Stratton to Sheriff Voss, instructing him to accelerate the land clearance process before the fiscal quarter ended. Attached was a list of remaining families, with Elise Morgan's address at the top. The country reacted like a lit fuse. Civil rights organizations like the Southern Justice Alliance and the Freedom Center called for immediate federal oversight of rural land seizures. Public defenders' offices across the region reopened old cases, hunting for evidence of similar setups. And in Washington, the Department of Justice announced an investigation into Harlan Grove Holdings and every county government connected to its land deals. In Oakhaven, the fallout was immediate. City Hall became a war zone of finger-pointing and resignation letters. Local business owners who had quietly profited from the land grabs suddenly found themselves the target of boycotts. Even the mayor, who once smiled beside Voss at fundraising galas, denied ever knowing about the scheme. But the paper trail told a different story. Andre wasn't finished. His next video exposed the human cost. He interviewed displaced families, single mothers forced to live in cars after their homes were condemned, elderly farmers driven off land their ancestors had owned for generations, and kids who woke up to flashing lights and court orders instead of breakfast. One line from his report hit the nation hardest. Oakhaven isn't the exception, it's the blueprint. Federal agents descended on the town, not quietly, but with subpoenas and camera crews. They raided Harlan Grove's local offices, carting out boxes of documents and hard drives. Stratton's inner circle began to fracture. One aide turned state's witness, providing enough testimony to implicate half the county planning commission. Meanwhile, Marcus stayed out of the spotlight. He watched from a distance as the machine unraveled. But he wasn't celebrating. He knew how these stories ended. The top layers would fall, but someone else would always be waiting in the shadows to rebuild. And so, while the world focused on Oakhaven, Marcus dug deeper into campaign contributions, corporate boards, and obscure land trusts that stretched far beyond their small town. Each new connection revealed the same story written in different names: profit over people, power over justice. That's when Marcus realized this wasn't just about Harlan Grove. It was bigger. A national network of wealth and silence that used sheriffs like Voss as disposable pawns in a much larger game. But they had made one mistake. They came for his family. And Marcus had no intention of stopping until the entire network burned to the ground. That night, after the headlines faded and the courthouse lights dim, Marcus stood alone on the porch of the house they almost lost. The crickets sang their quiet songs, and for the first time in weeks, there were no patrol cars parked across the street, no whispers in the dark. But peace wasn't what filled his chest. It was resolve. Elise stepped outside beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Maya slept soundly inside, her body healing, her spirit already stronger than the scars left behind. "You did it," Elise whispered. Marcus shook his head. "We started it." Because behind Harlan Grove Holdings, behind Edmund Stratton and his developers, there were others. Bigger players, national corporations, investment funds disguising land theft as progress, politicians who smiled for the cameras while signing deals in back rooms. This battle wasn't about one sheriff in a small town. It was about a system that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. And Marcus wasn't done. The next morning he met Reed and Cassandra back at the cabin. Spread across the table were fresh documents, bank transfers, real estate records, and encrypted emails they had decrypted overnight. New names surfaced. One was a senator's brother who quietly acquired farmland through a trust in Tennessee. Another was a retired oil executive funding private security forces in small counties like Oak Haven. Each name was another domino waiting to fall. "This thing goes to the top," Cassandra said, her voice grim. "We're talking about tens of millions in stolen land." Reed looked at Marcus, his weathered face both proud and tired. "You sure you want this fight? There won't be a finish line, just more fires to put out." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'm already in it." He spent the next few days quietly setting the next moves in motion. Anonymous tips sent to national reporters, leaked documents landing on the desks of federal investigators, secure calls to civil rights attorneys who had fought these battles before. But through it all, Marcus kept his face out of the news. He didn't want a legacy, he wanted results. And yet, in the town square, things had already begun to change. People who once crossed the street to avoid the Morgans now offered small nods, tentative smiles. The grocery clerk who once glared at Elise now carried her bags without being asked. Small things, but real. For the first time, the town didn't just see them as outsiders. They saw them as survivors who refused to be erased. That night, Marcus sat beside Maya's bed as she slept. He watched her chest rise and fall, steady and peaceful, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no other child woke up to flashing lights and fear. So he made himself a promise. He would dismantle every piece of this machine. And when the final domino fell, he'd walk away, not as a soldier at war, but as a father who finally found peace. But for tonight, the battle was done. The night was still. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt safe. 6 months after the trial, the Morgan family home no longer looked like the place where it all fell apart. It looked like the place where it began again. The peeling paint was gone, replaced with soft earth tones and bright windows. The sagging porch now stood strong, its steps lined with pots of lavender and rosemary. Where fear once crept through cracked walls, now laughter echoed through the hallways. And above the front door, a wooden sign carved with quiet pride read, "The Morgan Center for Family Justice." It wasn't just a building, it was a promise. Elise poured herself into the work, taking every scar and turning it into fuel. Inside the center, families found more than free legal aid and trauma counseling. They found dignity, a place where no one was too small to be heard, too broken to be believed. Veterans who had been denied services found job placement programs. Mothers fleeing abusive homes found safe housing referrals. Teens wrongfully profiled by law enforcement found mentors and advocates who looked them in the eye and told them they mattered. And leading the youth programs was Maya. Her scars hadn't faded, but she wore them like armor. She spoke at local schools about courage and survival. She launched a peer mentorship group for kids navigating trauma and injustice. Some days, she wheeled herself down the main hallway, guiding new visitors with a smile. Other days, she sat quietly in the reading corner, helping children untangle the fear they carried in their hearts. But even as the programs grew and the center filled with life, Elise knew the work was far from over. Every day brought a new family walking through those doors, holding stories that sounded too much like their own. Still, when she stood in the community garden behind the house, watching neighbors plant vegetables side by side, hearing kids laugh under the wide Carolina sky, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. On opening day, people came from all over. Families who had fled, people who had stayed silent too long, strangers who had read about Oak Haven and wanted to help. Elise stood on the porch and spoke softly, not as a victim, but as a survivor. This home was almost taken from us, but now it belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted into applause. And when Maya rolled forward to cut the ribbon with a pair of oversized silver scissors, Elise felt Marcus's hand slip into hers. His grip was steady, warm. For the first time, they weren't holding on out of fear. They were holding on to keep each other steady as they stepped into something new. That night, when the last car pulled away and the porch lights cast a warm glow across the front yard, Marcus sat alone on the steps, his elbows resting on his knees. The wind rolled through the trees like a quiet hymn, rustling the leaves that had fallen early with the changing season. Behind him, laughter drifted through the open window. Elise washing dishes, Maya teasing her about the community center's new volunteer sign-up sheet, already filling up. It was the kind of sound that made a man believe, even after everything, peace was possible. Marcus let himself breathe. It had been years since he felt safe enough to do that without watching his back. In the distance, the old gravel road stretched empty and still. No more slow-moving pickup trucks creeping past in the dark. No more tinted patrol cars idling at the edge of the yard, pretending to be invisible. The town itself felt different, not fixed, but awake. Neighbors who once crossed the street now waved when they passed by. The hardware store owner who once refused to sell Elise lumber had dropped off a donation of tools that morning, saying only, "Figure ya could use these." Small gestures, but to Marcus, they meant everything. He looked up at the stars cutting through the night sky and thought about the battles still ahead. Stratton was still out there. Harlan Grove Holdings might have taken a hit, but the roots of that network ran deep. There would be other towns, other families, other fights waiting just beyond the horizon. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, they had each other. He heard the screen door creak open and felt Elise sit beside him. She leaned against his shoulder, her presence quiet but steady. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elise whispered, "I forgot what this feels like." "What?" "Stillness. Safety." Marcus nodded, watching Maya through the window as she packed up leftover snacks from the opening ceremony. "He earned that peace," Marcus said softly. "So did you." "Celeste did," Elise whispered back. He let out a slow breath and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. For the first time in months, the weight on his chest felt lighter. But Marcus knew himself too well. Stillness was temporary. Quiet didn't last forever. He'd learned that overseas, and he'd relearn it right here at home. And yet, sitting beside the woman he nearly lost, and the daughter who had survived the unimaginable, Marcus allowed himself one simple truth. Even if peace didn't last, it was worth holding on to for as long as it did. The wind shifted again, rustling the wind chimes that Maya had hung from the porch beam. Their soft tones drifted into the night, mingling with the sounds of crickets and distant train whistles. For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel like a soldier waiting for the next war. He felt like a man who'd finally made it home. Morning light crept across the Morgan front porch when the quiet knock came. Marcus rose from his chair, his joints stiff but steady, and opened the door to find Detective Hayes standing there, coat slung over one shoulder, a file tucked beneath his arm. Hayes looked older than Marcus remembered, the kind of tired you don't fix with sleep. "Figured you'd want to see this first," Hayes said, handing over the file. Marcus took it without a word and glanced at the cover. 3 words stared back at him. Edmund Stratton, Harlan Grove Holdings. Inside, the file contained everything they'd been hunting: emails, financial transfers, shell company ownerships, offshore accounts, and the final link between Stratton and the county commissioners who authorized the land seizures. It was a blueprint of corruption, written in black ink and blood money. Hayes adjusted his glasses, watching Marcus closely. "He's the last one standing. We've got enough to put him in front of a grand jury, but it's your call. We move now or we wait until the timing's right." Marcus held the file in his hands, its weight heavier than the paper it was printed on. He thought about everything that had happened: Maya's quiet bravery, Elise's tireless strength, the way this house had transformed from a battlefield into a refuge. He could end it now, call the feds, light the match. But instead, he closed the file and set it down on the kitchen table. "Tomorrow," Marcus said quietly. "Tonight's for my family." Hayes gave a faint smile, the first real smile Marcus had seen from him in weeks. "You've earned it." Without another word, Hayes turned and disappeared down the porch steps, leaving Marcus standing in the morning light. Marcus watched the file for a long moment, the quiet hum of the house filling the silence. Elise appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Trouble?" "Opportunity," Marcus said softly. She rested her chin on his shoulder. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow." He turned back toward the window and watched as Maya wheeled herself into the garden, laughing with one of the neighborhood kids helping her water the plants. This was what they fought for. Not revenge, not headlines, but mornings like this. Mornings where his daughter laughed without fear. Mornings where his wife could smile without looking over her shoulder. The war wasn't over. Marcus knew that. Evil doesn't end with one man. It hides in boardrooms and backrooms, waiting for the next sheriff, the next developer, the next chance. But for today, the Morgan family had peace. And when tomorrow came, Marcus would pick up that file, put on his boots, and keep fighting. But not yet. For now, they were home. And home was enough.